The dust was the first thing she remembered and the last thing she would forget. It was a fine, pale powder that clung to her eyelashes and filmed the back of her throat. It rose from the ground with every shuffle of a boot, every nervous cough from the crowd that had gathered to watch her degradation. She had been standing tied to the hitching post in the center of what passed for a town square for 3 days. The sun had cracked the skin on her lips and baked the mud on her bare feet into a second, brittle skin. Her dress, a gray shift of indeterminate fabric, was frayed at the hem and stained with the memory of rain and dirt. It hung on her frame, thin as a fence rail. She kept her eyes fixed on a spot in the dirt just beyond her toes, a small universe of pebbles and a dead beetle. To look up was to meet their eyes, the curious, the scornful, the pitying, the bored. She had learned early that none of them offered salvation. They were just watchers, their faces a blur of sun-scorched judgment. A man named Jebson had put her there. He was a man made of loud noises and sweat, his voice a hammer that broke the quiet air. He had won her in a card game, he claimed, then found her more trouble than she was worth. Useless as a screen door on a submarine, he bellowed to anyone who would listen on the first day. Now his pronouncements had dwindled to a low, frustrated grumble. He wanted something for his trouble, a coin or two to salve his wounded pride. The ropes bit into her wrists. Not cruelly, not anymore. The initial fire had long since faded into a dull, permanent ache, a part of her body's new geography. Her world had shrunk to this circle of dust, the heat of the sun, the weight of the silence between insults. The people murmured. Their words were like stones rolling in a dry creek bed, indistinct but heavy. They talked of her as if she were a stray dog or a piece of busted tack, an object, an inconvenience. She had walked for 3 days with no shoes before Jebson had caught her. His horse a dark storm on the horizon. She had been running from a life that was just a different kind of post, a different kind of rope. Now, this public humiliation felt like the final word in a story she had never been allowed to write. She did not cry. The dust had taken all her water. She simply stood, a monument to ruin, and waited for the end of the day or the end of everything. He saw her first from the far side of the square, a shadow leaning against the wall of the general store. Elias had not come into town for spectacle. He had come for salt and flour, a journey he made only when the emptiness of his pantry became a more pressing matter than the emptiness of his heart. The town was a place of ghosts for him, of voices that still echoed in the space between buildings. He was a man carved from the land itself, all quiet angles and weathered textures. His coat was the color of the dirt, his eyes the gray of a winter sky. He carried whole winters in his eyes. He saw the woman at the post, her head bowed, her hair a tangle of straw and sunlight. He saw the way the crowd shifted around her, a restless tide of whispers. He recognized Jebson, a man whose greed was a loud sickness. Elias watched not with the morbid curiosity of the others, but with a still, heavy attention. He noted the bare feet, the raw wrists, the unbent line of her spine. There was a resilience in her stillness that the crowd could not see. They saw a discarded object. He saw a closed door. He had his own locked rooms, his own silent spaces. He knew what it was to stand alone in the full light of the sun and feel like a shadow. For a long time, he just watched. He saw Jebson spit into the dust, saw a woman in a clean apron pull her child away, saw a boy throw a pebble that landed short. Each small cruelty was a chip of ice against Elias's soul. He had lived with his own grief for 5 years, a quiet, solitary penance. He had asked for nothing and offered nothing. His life was a neat, closed loop of work and memory, of tending a small patch of earth in a single, well-tended grave. Jebson's voice cut through the afternoon haze. Last chance. Anyone take this baggage off my hands? Cost you next to nothing. Settle a debt. His voice was laced with the desperation of a bad gambler trying to recoup a loss. The crowd stirred, but no one stepped forward. She was marked. Damaged goods. Elias pushed himself off the wall. The movement was slow, deliberate, as if he were waking from a long sleep. He did not walk through the crowd but around it, his boots making no sound in the thick dust. He stopped a few feet from Jebson, his shadow falling over the man. Jebson squinted, recognizing him. Elias. Come for the show. Elias's gaze did not flicker. It was fixed on the woman. He saw a slight tremor in her shoulder, the only sign she was even breathing. What's the debt? His voice was low and used like it came from under floorboards. Jebson blinked, surprised. He puffed out his chest, smelling opportunity. She owes me. Board and keep. And for the trouble. Say $20. It was a lie, a number plucked from the greedy air. Elias didn't argue. He didn't bargain. He reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. He untied the drawstring and tipped a few coins into his palm. It wasn't $20. It was barely 5. He held it out. This is what I have. Jebson looked from the coins to Elias's face. He saw no bluff, no room for negotiation. He saw something as unyielding as granite. He grumbled, looking for a way to save face. It'll have to do. Consider it a favor to a neighbor. He snatched the coins, his fingers greasy and quick. Elias stepped past him. He stood before the woman, who still had not looked up. He drew a small, worn pocket knife. The blade clicked open. A sharp, clean sound in the heavy air. He did not speak to her. He simply reached out and, with 2 swift movements, sawed through the coarse ropes. The severed ends fell into the dust. For a moment, she did not move. Her hands remained in the air, ghosting the shape of her bondage. Then, slowly, as if testing their freedom, she lowered them to her sides. She flexed her fingers, her knuckles white. She still did not look at him. He turned and walked away, not waiting to see if she would follow. He walked back to his wagon, a simple buckboard hitched to a patient, weary-looking horse. The dust lifted behind him like ghosts. He didn't look back. He trusted the silence. He trusted that freedom, once given, would know its own direction. She stood alone in the center of the square. The crowd, their entertainment over, began to disperse, melting back into the doorways and alleys from which they had come. They left her in the sudden, ringing quiet. She looked at her feet, then at her freed hands, the raw, red bracelets on her wrists. She took a breath, and it was the first one that felt like her own. Then, slowly, she took a step. And another. She followed the path his boots had made in the dust. The journey was a silent covenant. He helped her onto the wagon seat, his touch brief and impersonal on her elbow, and then he climbed up beside her and clicked the reins. The horse, grateful for movement, leaned into its harness, and the wagon groaned as it rolled out of the town that had no name for her. The sun began its long slide toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood orange and bruised purple. The land stretched out before them, vast and empty, a canvas of dry grass and distant, hazy mountains. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels and the soft plod of the horse's hoofs. He did not speak. She did not speak. The silence was not empty, it was a space they were both learning to occupy. She sat straight-backed, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the endless horizon. She had been passed from one man to another like a sack of grain, but this felt different. There had been no pronouncements, no claims of ownership. Just a transaction as stark and simple as the landscape they moved through. She did not know if she had been bought or rescued. After an hour, the heat of the day gave way to the cool breath of evening. Elias reached behind him and pulled a dusty canteen from a sack. He uncorked it, took a short drink, then held it out to her. His eyes remained on the trail ahead. She hesitated for only a second before taking it. Her hands trembled as she brought it to her cracked lips. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it was the kindest thing she had known in an age. She drank slowly, carefully, then handed it back. Their fingers did not touch. He recorked it and set it back in its place. That was all. A shared drink. An unspoken acknowledgement of a shared thirst. They traveled until the sky was a deep, stardusted velvet. He pulled the wagon off the faint track and into a shallow draw, sheltered from the wind that had begun to rise, a low moan across the plains. He unhitched the horse and tended to it first, giving it water and a small measure of oats. His movements were efficient, practiced, the motions of a man who had done the same thing 1,000 times alone. She slid down from the wagon, her bare feet sinking into the cool, soft earth. She watched him, a dark shape against the darker landscape. He built a small fire, the flint and steel striking sparks into a nest of dry tinder. The flame caught, a tiny, bright flower that bloomed in the darkness, pushing back the immense loneliness of the prairie. He took a loaf of bread and a wedge of hard cheese from his sack. He broke the bread in half and handed her a piece, along with a slice of the cheese. They ate by the firelight, the crackle of the flames the only conversation. The bread was stale, the cheese sharp, but it was food she had not had to beg for. It filled a hollowness inside her that went deeper than hunger. When they were done, he laid out a bedroll for himself near the fire. From the wagon, he pulled a thick, woolen blanket, patched in several places but clean. He walked over to where she stood by the wagon wheel and held it out. "The wagon bed is dry," he said. It was the first full sentence he had spoken to her. His voice was rough but not unkind. She took the blanket. It was heavy and it smelled faintly of wood smoke and winter. She nodded, a small, jerky movement. He went back to his bedroll, turned his back to her, and lay down. He was asleep, or pretending to be, within minutes. She climbed into the back of the wagon. The wooden boards were hard beneath her, but the blanket was a fortress of warmth. She wrapped it around herself, pulling it up to her chin. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, no one was watching her. There were no ropes, no locks. The wind turned mean outside her small shelter, but inside there was a strange, fragile peace. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the vast, open silence of the night and the steady breathing of the man by the fire. She did not know his name. She did not know where they were going. But for tonight, that was enough. They arrived at his home the next afternoon. It was not so much a farm as a scar on the land that was trying to heal. The house was small, built of sod and weathered timber, its roof sagging slightly in the middle as if tired of holding up the sky. A windmill spun with a rhythmic, mournful squeak. A few chickens scratched in the dust near a small, sturdy-looking barn. The place was stark, functional, stripped of any ornament. It was a reflection of the man who lived there. To the east of the house, under the shade of a lone, gnarled cottonwood, was a small, fenced-off plot of earth. A simple wooden cross stood at its head. He did not look at it as he pulled the wagon to a halt, but she felt its presence, a quiet weight in the air. The land itself was holding its breath. He got down and, without a word, began to unhitch the horse. She slid off the wagon, her feet tender on the hard-packed earth. The place felt profoundly isolated, a tiny island in an ocean of brown grass. The wind was the only constant companion here. When he was done with the horse, he walked to the door of the house and pushed it open. It swung inward on complaining hinges, revealing a single, dim room. He stood in the doorway and looked at her. He didn't beckon, just waited. She walked toward him, her steps slow. The threshold felt like a precipice. Inside, the room was spare and clean. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean. A narrow bed covered with a patched quilt was tucked into a corner. On the other side of the room, a curtain of faded calico hung across an alcove. He walked to the curtain and pulled it aside. Behind it was another small cot, a thin mattress stuffed with straw. "This is yours," he said. He let the curtain fall, granting her immediate privacy. He then went to the fireplace and began to build a fire, his back to her. That was the beginning of the unspoken contract. He provided food. He assigned her a safe space to sleep. He respected her privacy. Later that evening, she noticed the house had no lock on its door, just a simple wooden latch. He was not her jailer. He was something else. She had no word for it. The days that followed fell into a rhythm as steady and predictable as the turning of the windmill. They did not speak of the past. They did not speak of the future. They communicated through the language of work. He would rise before dawn, his movements quiet in the small house. She would wake to the smell of coffee and the sound of him moving about the yard. By the time she emerged from behind her curtain, he would be gone, out mending a fence line or tending to the small vegetable patch behind the house. He always left a portion of whatever he'd made for breakfast on the table for her, a piece of cornbread, a bowl of oatmeal. She, in turn, found her own tasks. She swept the packed earth floor until it was smooth. She learned the quirks of the wood stove, coaxing it to bake bread that was only slightly less dense than a brick. The first loaf she made was a disaster. When he came in for his midday meal, he picked it up, tested its weight in his hand, and set it down. "That loaf died in vain," he said, his mouth twitching with the barest hint of a smile. She felt a hot flush of shame, but he simply took his portion and ate it without another word of complaint. The next time, it was better. He nodded after the first bite. "Less dry." "You didn't complain about mine," she heard herself say, her voice thin from disuse. He looked at her, a real look, his gray eyes softening for a moment. Wasn't anything to complain about. She began to tend the chickens, to mend his worn shirts with thread she unraveled from a ruined grain sack. She found a rhythm in the simple, repetitive tasks. Each stitch was a tiny act of reclamation. She was not just a mouth to feed, she was a pair of hands that could create order, could mend what was torn. One afternoon, while weeding the vegetable patch, her fingers brushed against a single, stubborn wildflower that had pushed its way through the hard soil. It was a spot of brilliant blue in a world of brown and gray. On impulse, she picked it. She carried it back to the house, its stem fragile in her hand. She walked past the house to the lone cottonwood tree. She hesitated at the small wooden gate of the fenced-in grave, then unlatched it and stepped inside. The earth was clear of weeds. He took care of this place. She knelt and pushed the stem of the wildflower into the dirt at the base of the wooden cross. There was a name carved into it, weathered by the sun and rain, Anna. She felt him watching her. She turned and he was standing by the corner of the barn, his work forgotten. He did not look angry. He just looked hollowed out. He watched her for a long moment, then turned and went back to his work. He never mentioned the flower. But the next day he left a small pair of worn leather work gloves on the table for her. Her size. The small kindnesses became a silent conversation. He would leave a bucket of water by the door so she didn't have to work the squealing pump. She would ensure his dinner was warm when he came in late, exhausted from a day of chasing a stray calf. He fixed the handle on the broom when it split. She patched the elbow of his coat with a piece of her own ruined dress. They were stitching their lives together with raw thread, creating a tapestry of shared, quiet care. The nights grew colder. The wind that swept across the plains had teeth now. One night, a storm blew in, a torrent of rain and violent gusts that made the little house groan. A crack of thunder, sharp and sudden as a gunshot, shook the walls. She woke with a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sound was too much like other sounds, other nights. She sat bolt upright on her cot, trembling, the darkness behind the curtain pressing in on her. She heard him stir in the main room. "The storm will pass," he said. His voice a low rumble from the other side of the fabric. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, calm and steady. She couldn't answer. Her throat was tight with a fear that had no name. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders, her knuckles white. She didn't want to be locked in. She didn't want to be trapped in the dark. She heard the scrape of a chair. A moment later, the gentle crackle of a fire starting. He didn't try to talk to her again. He just sat by the fire, a silent sentinel. The warm orange light seeped under her curtain, a thin line of defense against the suffocating blackness. She could hear the soft sounds of his presence, the occasional shift of his weight, the rustle of him adding a small log to the flames. He stayed there all night. He guarded her from the storm, from the dark, from the ghosts that haunted it. When dawn finally broke, gray and weeping, the fire was still glowing and he was asleep in the chair. A week later, they were sitting at the table eating their evening meal in the usual quiet. The firelight threw long, dancing shadows on the walls. She looked at her hands, then at him. "Why," she asked, the word barely a whisper. "Why did you take me?" Elias finished chewing a piece of bread, his movements slow. He looked into the fire, not at her. "The ground is hard here," he said, his voice even. "Too hard for one person to break alone," he paused. "And I don't hold with tying people to posts." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was a piece of it, and it was the most he had ever offered. It was enough. "My name," she said into the silence, offering a piece of her own. "It's Lena." He looked at her then, a real acknowledgement in his gray eyes. He nodded once. "Lena," he repeated, testing the sound of it in the quiet room. The name hung in the air, a new and solid thing. It was the first brick in a foundation. The first sign of trouble was a smudge of dust on the western horizon, a place where no dust should be. Elias saw it from the roof of the barn where he was patching a hole before the first snow. He froze, his hammer held aloft. It was not a dust devil, aimless and wandering. This dust had purpose. It moved in a straight line toward them. He slid down the ladder, his face set in hard lines. He did not run. His movements were clipped, efficient. He walked into the house. Lena was kneading dough on the table, her hands covered in flour. She looked up at the expression on his face and her own went still. "Go inside," he said, his voice flat. "Stay behind the curtain." She didn't argue. She wiped her hands on her apron, her eyes wide and dark, and disappeared behind the faded calico. The bread was left unfinished on the table. Elias took his rifle from its pegs above the mantelpiece. He checked the action, his hands steady. He didn't load it. Not yet. He walked outside and stood in the yard between the house and the oncoming riders. He was a solitary figure, a man planted in the earth, waiting for the storm to break. There were 3 of them. As they drew closer, he recognized the man in the lead. Jebson. His face was flushed with cheap whiskey and self-importance. The 2 men with him were strangers, hard-faced men who looked like they were for hire. They pulled up their horses a dozen yards from where Elias stood, their mounts kicking up a cloud of dirt that settled over everything. Jebson grinned, a cruel slash in his fleshy face. "Elias," he called out, his voice slick with false bonhomie. "Good to see you. Just came to collect what's mine." "You have nothing here, Jebson," Elias said. His voice was quiet, but it carried on the wind. "Oh, I think I do," Jebson sneered, gesturing toward the house with his chin. "I made a bad deal. Drunk and foolish. Man's allowed to change his mind. That woman is property." "My property?" I've come to take her back. His argument was based on the oldest lie, the lie of ownership that a person could be a thing. You took my coin, Elias stated. The deal was done. That was a down payment. A rental fee. Jebson laughed and the men with him chuckled nervously. She's worth more than that. I have a buyer in the next county who'll pay a fair price. Now, step aside. We don't want any trouble. Elias didn't move. He was a rock, a part of the unyielding landscape. The trouble is already here. You brought it. Now turn your horses and ride away. Jebson's face darkened. The pretense of civility fell away. I'm not asking, he began to dismount, his hand moving toward the pistol on his hip. The door to the house creaked open. Lena stepped out. She was not hiding behind the curtain. She was not trembling. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with a cold fire. In her hands, she held Elias's heavy wood-cutting axe. She did not hold it like a weapon she knew how to use, but she held it like she meant to. She walked, her bare feet silent in the dust, and stood beside Elias. She didn't look at him. Her gaze was locked on Jebson, a look of pure, undiluted loathing. She had found her voice, and it was a silent scream of defiance. Jebson stopped, his hand hovering over his gun. He had expected a cowering rabbit, not this. He saw two people, not one man and a prize. He saw a wall. She's mine, he roared, his voice cracking with frustration. No, Lena said. The word was not loud. It was not a plea. It was a statement of fact as solid and real as the axe in her hands. It was the sound of a lock breaking. Elias stood his ground, the rifle held loosely in his hands, his body a shield for her. He did not need to raise it. His presence, combined with hers, was its own force. They were two solitary trees that had grown together, their roots intertwined, unbreakable. The hired men shifted in their saddles, looking from Jebson to the two figures in the yard. This wasn't what they had been paid for. They'd been hired to intimidate a lone farmer and retrieve a scared woman, not to face down whatever this was. This was something more complicated, something dangerous. Jebson saw the hesitation in his men's eyes. He saw the unyielding certainty in Elias's and Lena's. His bluster was a hollow thing against their solid silence. He was a bully, and bullies only thrive on fear. There was no fear here, only resolve. He spat on the ground, a final, pathetic gesture of contempt. Keep her, then, he snarled. She's not worth dying for. He heaved himself back onto his horse, yanked on the reins with unnecessary force, and galloped away, his hired men trailing behind him like stray dogs. They stood together in the yard, watching until the dust settled back into the earth, until the silence returned. The wind whispered around them, cleaning the air. The confrontation was over. The land was theirs again. Lena's arms began to shake and the heavy axe head dipped toward the ground. Elias reached out and gently took it from her hands. His fingers brushed against hers. It was the first time they had touched with intention, a touch of pure connection, not function. He leaned the axe against the wall of the house. He looked at her, at the fierce, fragile strength in her face. You didn't have to do that, he said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. Yes, she said, her own voice trembling slightly. I did. He nodded, understanding completely. He turned and walked back into the house. She followed. The unfinished bread was still on the table. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers. The house, which had held its breath, seemed to breathe again. A deep, slow sigh of relief. That night, the quiet was different. It was not a space between words, but a language in itself. They sat by the fire, the warmth pushing back the chill of the evening and the deeper chill of what had almost been. He looked at her, the firelight catching the gold in her hair. This is your home now, Lena, he said, the words feeling heavy and true in his mouth. If you'll have it. She didn't answer with words. She simply nodded, a slow, certain movement. A tear, the first she had shed in this place, traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of arrival. The next morning, they went out together to the fence line that Jebson's horse had damaged in its panicked retreat. The post was splintered, the wire slack. They worked together to fix it. He dug a new hole while she cleared the broken wood. He set the post, and she held it steady while he tamped the earth around it, their hands sometimes brushing as they worked. They were not just mending a fence. They were rebuilding their world. They were declaring its boundaries. When the work was done, they stood for a moment, looking out over the vast, quiet land that stretched before them. It was a harsh and lonely place, but it was no longer empty. It was theirs. That winter, the first snows came, blanketing the prairie in a pristine, silent white. The world shrank to the small, warm circle of the house. The quiet between them was now comfortable, a soft blanket woven from shared days and mutual respect. He taught her how to read using the handful of books he owned, an almanac, a Bible, a worn copy of Shakespeare. Her voice, at first hesitant, grew stronger as she sounded out the words, filling the small cabin with stories. One evening, sitting by the fire, she looked up from her book and saw him watching her. There was a warmth in his eyes she had never seen before, a light that had pushed back the long winter of his grief. "Anna would have liked you," he said quietly. It was the first time he had spoken her name aloud to Lena. It was not a ghost that stood between them, but a blessing. She reached out and placed her hand on his, the one resting on the arm of his chair. His skin was rough, calloused, but his hand was warm. He turned his palm up and laced his fingers through hers. They sat like that for a long time, the fire crackling, the wind howling outside, their silence a perfect, complete sentence. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. Spring came, and the land was reborn. Green shoots pushed through the thawing earth. The lone cottonwood by the grave sprouted new leaves. The house no longer felt haunted or hollow. It breathed with the rhythm of their life together. It was filled not with possessions, but with a sense of purpose. The final image was not one of passion, but of deep, abiding peace. Elias and Lena sat on the small porch he had built, watching the sun set. A new, slightly less lopsided loaf of bread cooled on the windowsill. Her head rested against his shoulder, and his arm was around her, a comfortable, protective weight. The windmill squeaked its familiar song. The sky was awash in the soft colors of evening. They had been two broken pieces, two solitary souls adrift in a harsh world. But here, in the vast quiet, they had found more than shelter. They had found a home. They had named each other. And that was everything. This story, it isn't just about a rescue. It's not about a man saving a woman from a dusty square. It is about the quiet courage it takes to accept a hand that is offered without promise. It is about the slow, patient work of healing, the way two lonely people can mend the broken fences of each other's pasts, not with grand words, but with shared silence, a warm meal, and the simple, unspoken vow to stand as a wall against the world, together. We all have a name waiting for us, a name that we can only hear when we finally stop running. It might be whispered by a stranger who asks for nothing in return. It might be found in the taste of clean water after a long thirst, or in the warmth of a fire on a cold night. So here's your naming. It's in the quiet act of kindness you didn't have to give. It's in the moment you stand for someone when it would be easier to walk away. And if you're brave enough to answer, if you're brave enough to follow the path of a silent stranger into the unknown, you might not find what you were looking for. You might find something better. You might find you were home all along. You just needed someone to leave the door unlocked.